Hi, I am Luis Fernando, the Executive Director of SOS Mata Atlântica, a Brazilian NGO with the mission to inspire society to engage in the protection of the Atlantic forest, one of the most beautiful ecosystems of the world. Well, to have a new economy, we need first of all to understand that we humans are part of nature, that we depend on nature and the ecosystem service it provides for our economy, society, and health. A new economy needs to be based on renewable energy, renewable materials, restoration of ecosystem services, regenerative agriculture to assure our future. But besides all, we also need behavioral changes. We need less consumption, much less consumption. We need peace. We need love among people. We need justice and equity. We need to face inequalities, which is a root of most of our problems. For it, we need collaboration among all stakeholders, companies, governments, civil society, everyone. It only will be possible if we work together, based on science and ethics. I wish you all a great event.
Okay, now we are going to switch to English to invite Bernice Lee and Emanuel Guerin to the stage for a fireside chat. Both are experts on the geopolitical environment and, in particular, on how the political dynamics of the biodiversity and climate challenges interact with the wider global shifts. The previous panel that we have just had outlined how climate extremes pose a challenge to agriculture and food. In fact, the disruptive impacts of a changing climate and its relationship with the natural world affects every single part of the global economy and the livelihoods of people in all sectors. So, to tackle this important topic, let me welcome Bernice Lee, not French. You're Emanuel was teaching me the Guerin. Bernice chairs the advisor board of the Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator and also the board of the event host, Bellwethers Group. She serves on the boards of Energy Foundation China and Chapter Zero Alliance, as well as several corporate sustainability advisor boards, and is a frequent media commentator. So Bernice will shape a conversation now with Emmanuel Guerin, who serves as a special advisor to the CEO of the European Climate Foundation and is also a fellow at the Instituto Clima Sociedade and vice dean of the Climate School at Science Paul Paris. So now, welcome both Bernice and Emmanuel. The stage is yours.
Thank you. A great conversation. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll sit this way. Well, good morning, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to be hosting this session here with Emmanuel Cahan. Obviously, that was the reason why Bellwethers is set up to have a conversation of this sort, even though it's not fireside, by the fireside today. The reason for that is because we hear about geopolitics a lot nowadays. Every day you open the newspaper, people say, in this geopolitical time, this means with this kind of chaos, this means X, Y, and Z. So I thought today what we would do is to sort of go back a bit to basics. The weirdest thing is that for me is that Emmanuel is a good friend of mine. We often text each other with these sort of questions. So I kind of feel like we're bringing something private as well to this audience, which I'm very, very, very excited about. Emmanuel, what do we mean when we text each other about geopolitics? What do you think we usually mean?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Very happy to be with you all this morning, and indeed very happy to continue in front of other people the conversation that we often have between the two of us. I think you're exactly right. We often talk about the new geopolitics of climate and nature, and it's not always very clear what we mean by that. And I think an important starting point for this conversation is to appreciate how much the world has changed, but also the fact that the climate and nature community at large has not yet fully grasped both the magnitude of the change and the nature of this change. So I think it's okay to not have a response to this new context that is fully ready, fully fledged. It's okay to be a bit speculative, to float assumptions, but what is not okay is to stick to an old worldview, to cling onto a view of the world of the past, and to think that we need to only incrementally change the way in which we look at the geopolitics of climate and nature. I'd like to focus my initial remarks before we dig deeper into some geographies, including Europe, including China, including, I hope, with you, Brazil. I'd like to focus my initial remarks on a particular aspect of the geopolitics of climate and nature, not pretending that this is the whole of the geopolitics, but I think it's a very important part of these new geopolitics, and that is the geopolitics of value chains. Because I think in 2025 and for the years to come, power really flows through value chains. Power flows through who designs those value chains. Power flows through who sets the rules for these value chains, who finances those value chains, and who manages to extract value and to build profit or to extract rent from these value chains. So I think in the climate and nature community, by and large, for the past few years, we've been used to think of sectors. If you think about it, I mean, this is still the way the IPCC reports are written. This is also largely how the action agenda for COPs is structured through sectors, but I think value chains are a more powerful concept these days to think about the geopolitics and the economics of climate and nature. So I think in 2025, the geopolitics.
So it is about power.
It is
about
power.
geography. It is about who controls means of production.
Yes.
How you buy stuff from, the sourcing. That's what you mean by value chains.
Yes.
And it's also about who do you work with in order to make sure that you get to what you need to the other side, right?
Precisely. And so I think it's very important to understand that in 2025, compared to, for example, 2015, 10 years ago, when we adopted the Paris Agreement, the geopolitics of climate and nature are no longer the traditional diplomacy among nation states. I mean, in fairness, already in 2015, the diplomacy of climate and nature was no longer just about the relations in between nation states. I mean, a big innovation that the Paris Agreement brought was to bring in non-state actors, local authorities, businesses, investors to open up the political space for climate action in front of governments who have a tendency to be more conservative. But I think these days, and that trend was amplified in Glasgow at COP26 and in Dubai at COP28. But I think today we need another big innovation in how we build the system, because frankly, as I said, the way I look at it, the issue is less who makes a new pledge for reducing emissions or something else, but who controls the value chain and who manages to bring some value to it. So for me, it's really the type of change that we need these days.
So climate diplomacy is going to be about how different types of cooperation or competition evolves in different kinds of, supply chains and value chains where different actors capture value. So if it means that real economy actors have to be involved as well.
Yes.
So what does it mean from a climate diplomacy perspective?
So I think the real issue for the climate and nature transition to happen at the speed and the scale we need is to address the bottlenecks that we've got in those value chains, both in clean energy technology, in critical minerals, and in nature assets. And some of those bottlenecks are physical. Other bottlenecks are more geopolitical or geoeconomic in nature. To talk about an example, and you and I have written on this, we argue in a paper that we published together that in order for the transition to accelerate, China needs to better share the green pie with other countries, because it's very impressive the way China has built a global dominance on virtually all of the major clean energy technologies. And I think we need to appreciate that the first order impact of that massive investment in China is to lower the cost of the transition in other countries, which is a massive positive benefit. But the second order consequence of that dominance is that it creates some fear in other countries, and in particular in rich OECD countries, that if they open too much their borders to China clean energy technology, it's going to destroy their industry. So you see a wave of climate protectionism in Europe and in the US and other parts of the world.
So in some ways, I think what we've learned, right, in the last decade really is that nobody really wants to be excessively dependent on one partner.
Yes.
And secondly, it is also important that if you are the one selling, even though you are doing something good for the world, such as reducing the cost, unless you can help the other side understand their understanding of how to benefit from the green transition, you may create the backlash that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And for me, I think there is an interesting parallel to be drawn with the global trade regime more generally, because, and we need to be careful that there isn't a backlash on climate action the way there was and still is a backlash on the liberalization of global trade. And that's why I talked about, the first order impact, which is positive, but the second order impact, which is more negative. Because if you think about it, it's exactly the same equation. I mean, the free trade might be beneficial on average globally, but it has negative consequences on some communities within countries, and you need to address very seriously those negative consequences. Otherwise, you've got a backlash against something that is positive on average. So I think in particular in the discussion in between Europe and China, and I'm spending a lot of time discussing with you, with colleagues in Europe and China, it's important to find the fine line in between trade being used as one among many instruments, including industrial policy, including innovation policy, but as one of the instruments to create the political and economic conditions for the acceleration of climate action at the domestic level, which is in part what Europe is doing through its carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also to appreciate, and the Chinese are very much stressing this point, that trade needs to be turned into an instrument for international cooperation and the acceleration of the transition at the global level, which is something that China really needs to export some of its excess capacity to other countries and fight the process of involution in China.
Yeah, it's funny. We are very sad people, aren't we? Because we listen to podcasts about this concept of involution, which is how the Chinese basically have such an excessive competition in their own economy. Effectively, it's funny, isn't it? Because it's often seen as a very market-controlled economy, but actually, oftentimes, it encourages the level of competition among its competitors. That it means that there's a huge price war all the time. That has benefited some of us because the solar energy and others become much cheaper. But actually, that meant that many of these companies couldn't really continue. Now, these dynamics are now, I wouldn't say they're well known, but better understood in terms of the importance of making sure that your partners are benefiting from the green pie, and also making sure that we understand each other's domestic constraints. But I was just looking to next week in Berlin, or coming up in Berlin, these dynamics, which are obviously not always positive, sometimes quite difficult and challenging. How do you think it might play out next week in the context of Berlin, and what does it mean from a Brazilian perspective, given you spend a lot of time here in Brazil with the Institute for Society and Climate and Society, but also in your work with the European Climate Foundation here as well?
Yeah, so let me respond to this question by looking at it first from an American perspective, then from a Chinese perspective, and to conclude from a European perspective. From an American perspective, I'm coming from Rio and the local leaders forum, and what we've seen is a very strong response by many American governors and American mayors that, in spite of the federal level and the Trump administration turning its back on climate policy, many American mayors and American governors are staying on course and will, to some extent, compensate for the lack of leadership at the federal level. Of course, the big unknown is whether the US is going to play an active, destructive role in the negotiations in Belém, or whether it will be more passive. I think we need to be extremely careful about this, because there is a risk that the US plays a role similar to the one it played at the International Maritime Organization, where it really managed to completely derail the talks. So I would encourage all of us to stand ready to bring a forceful response in case the US plays an actively disruptive role. Looking at China, to be honest, it's very impressive to see China staying on course. It's in spite of what the US is doing. And so I think China is going to lead the coalition of countries that oppose any type of obstruction by the US. So China is really an asset in the response to the US. To say a few words about Europe, because yesterday Europe announced its nationally determined contributions for 2035. To be honest, I think it's a good NDC. It was a huge relief to see Europe finally come up with its NDC. It was way too late. It should have come way earlier. Brazil and the UK were much better at doing it on time. Even China did it with a delay, but still earlier than Europe. I think all of that came at a cost from a geopolitical perspective, because it meant that Europe no longer had either the moral high ground or the transactional power to shift the dynamics in the preparation for Belém. But I'm quite hopeful that with Europe having an NDC, it's going to be in a better position to build alliances for a successful outcome at COP, in particular forging a partnership with the Brazilian presidency, but also the small island and developing states and some of the least developed countries.
Thank you. I mean, I think that it's funny. Yesterday, I was giving a speech on the main stage and at the principle for responsible investment, where we talked a lot about the need not just to work with the coalition of the willing, but really right now we have to figure out a way to work with the coalition of the doing, people who are doing things, because at least you work with where the doors are already open, so you're not having to kick through the doors. We're also living in a world where we increasingly see a multipolar order. So maybe this is a place for you to sort of maybe wrap up your final thoughts as well. In the world where we have to find coalitions where we can do something, and secondly, where we have to think about a better way to do power sharing, how do you think is the best outcome from your perspective that could actually help both geopolitics as well as climate and nature next week?
Well, let me respond to that question by giving you an example, which is very important for me, which is what is it that we can do on methane emissions? I mean, methane being a super pollutant with a warming potential that is much higher in the short term than carbon emissions, and therefore methane, together with avoided deforestation, in particular in primary rainforest, being absolutely essential to pulling the climate emergency brake, which I think is a big part of what COP30 needs to deliver to respond to the overshoot of the 1.5 degree Celsius in temperature increase. And I think methane provides one of the best examples of the coalitions of the doing that you're calling for, and not just the coalition of the willing. There is something in particular that we're pushing very hard, and that is either going to be announced at the Leaders Summit today or tomorrow, or during the COP itself, which is the creation of a club that would bring together the producers of oil and gas and the importers of oil and gas, that would harmonize their regulations on methane emissions to stop flaring. And I think this is exactly the type of response that we need to see. I mean, as I said, moving away from just voluntary targets and voluntary pledges, but going through a coordinated response in terms of regulation and policy. So for me, that's a clear example of the type of coalition that we've got to build. And that's a way of being stronger together in front of the attacks coming from the US.
Brilliant. I think this is a great example to illustrate the kind of things that we need to build and do together with those who are willing, but also to encourage those who are less willing to come on board as well. With that, I think that, it's funny, as I was thinking about it just now, that all these years back now, the pandemic time, when Sharon and I were talking about setting up Bellwethers Group, little did I know that many years later we'll be sitting here on stage talking about geopolitics at a time when obviously many is still to play for. So with that, obviously Godspeed everybody in terms of what we need to achieve next week in Belém. Thank you for giving us a very thoughtful reflection on the different mechanisms and pros and cons of, basically friends and enemies and frenemies in this world we live in. So thank you very much. Thank you, Emanuel. Please join me in thanking him.
Pleasure.